Hello and welcome to today's edition of the Negotiation Room. It's a special day today because, gosh, we have conducted around 40 different negotiation rooms so far. We've had a whole miscellany of experts on the program. I think in grand total, well over 50 of them. And we're delighted to be joined today, of course, not only is Keld here with me, as always, but by one of our experts, Jim Daly from Google, who, oh gosh, I don't know how many times we've exposed you to this experience now, Jim. I don't know why it is you
I'm
keep
becoming
coming
a
back.
frequent traveler. I think there should be some kind of miles I could collect for joining the webinar. So thanks for having me again. Appreciate it.
Well, Cal, I mean, it's been an exciting investigation looking at all of the different conversations, the diversity of the things we covered, ranging from humor to anger to those who take perhaps a more structured, economic, analytical view, um, trying to make sense of it all. Well, let's get started. What did you make of your study of all of these weird and wonderful stories that we featured? And of course, just a quick word to our audience. As always, do please use chat facility. Get started by just saying hello to everybody and telling them where you're from. And we love to see your comments, and we'll be observing them as we go through and introducing them as appropriate to the conversation. Kel, over to you.
Yeah, well, Jim, thank you for joining us as always. I love you having on board. Yes, Tim, it was exciting. You know, I'm a bit of a nerd, partly into negotiation and partly into research, because when you do your doctorate, you've basically been trained in doing research and diving into data. And this was the opportunity for my team and myself, because we did transcripts of all the episodes, Tim, we've done. And that turned out to be 967 pages. I repeat, 967 pages and about 370,000 words. And then when you run thematic and sentiment analysis, you can actually gather a lot of data. You know, what is it that people talk about the most? And you can divide it into positive words and negative words and neutral words and what have you. So over the past years, Tim, you and I, we've been doing a lot of these episodes. We've spoken to procurement professionals, professors, psychologists, CEOs, government advisors. And there was one thing that struck me, and that was, despite all these different industries, background, educations, perspective, as I will show you, I prepared a small slide deck today just to go through the data. We found that we kept circling around the same core challenges, Tim. Regardless of the topic of the episode, it was basically the same thing. And some of the words that was repeated over and over again, regardless of the topic of the episode, was trust, value, time, and people, which I thought was perhaps not surprising, but a little bit interesting. So after we reviewed all 38 transcripts from the 38 episodes, we noticed something fascinating. Not only what was said, but what wasn't said. So words like negotiation, not a big surprise, appeared all the time. People appeared all the time as well. And value came up all the time. But so did risk, percentage, contract, and often at the expense of words like profit, partnership, and conversation. So today, we have a very different panel today, because obviously we're going to take a moment to reflect and debrief. And I think we can all learn a lot. And not only do we have a wonderful opportunity for research paper here, Tim, there's actually a wonderful opportunity for a book as well, because I feel honored that we had so many bright and intelligent people who've actually joined us throughout the period we've done that and shared so much value. I mean, the amount of value we have gained through this episode is just remarkable. So my ambition is that Jim can help us out and basically just take us through, you know, some of some of his viewpoints on what is really important and not important. So Jim, very quick question. When I mentioned the four words, trust, value, time, and people, in connection with negotiation, is that something that surprises you? Or you just going, yeah, of course, they should be part of all the words that reappear all the time?
I would not say it surprises me at all. And I'd almost say close to that order in terms of top. I'd probably put people a little ahead of time in there in terms of the top four. But having trust, number one, I think in today's world, that's definitely what we all agree to and strive for in these negotiations, as we're kind of getting in a little more open transparency and back and forth negotiations with different companies.
Mhm.
The data is at our hands and fingertips much easier today. So having that trust currency is so important. I think having that as the top one probably
Right.
makes sense.
So, Tim, I'm just trying to break it down here. And when we look at thematic and sentiment analysis, we can break it down in positive words that obviously have a positive meaning between human beings, negative words that obviously have the opposite, and then neutral that is not negative, but just doesn't represent a strong positive or negative. But the conclusion here, as we did running this through AI and did a very thorough analysis, is as we said down here, there's twice as many positive words as negative, but the vast majority of words are neutral. And this suggests the language leans toward constructive or neutral framing, ideal for collaborative focused negotiation. So I guess, Tim, one of the conclusion is based on 38 episodes that everybody leans toward collaborative negotiation. Everybody wants to create value. Everybody wants to collaborate. Everybody wants transparency and trust, as we'll see in the word cloud in a minute. So, Tim, you have so many years of experience. Why does this become so complicated and difficult in reality when we can all have all the experts sitting here talking about it? Everybody wants the same, but then we go out in reality and do quite the opposite.
Well, I think in fairness and in the interest of objectivity here, Kel, we have to acknowledge that we tend to invite people onto the program if they somewhat accord with our values and if we like them. We've
Sure.
not really gone out of our way to look for people who are obnoxious, objectionable, or negative. Um,
Right.
so we may have a somewhat distorted viewpoint based, of course, upon that selection process. And of course, I say this to a degree with humor, but I think nonetheless it is true. Now, as you know, we've often asked this question about people's preference. And yes, you're absolutely right. An overwhelming majority, I think close to 80%, are very clear that their goal, their preference is collaborative negotiation. 2 points on that. One, that still leaves 20% then who say, no, it isn't. So I guess they bring us part of the answer to the problem. But actually, of course, the 80% say, well, yes, it's my preference, but actually, no, I often can't actually engage with that. And of course, they attribute that to the other side. But I think what we often see is, unfortunately, we often go into negotiations saying, well, yeah, that's how I'd like it to be, but I don't really believe it will be. So I don't actually trust the counterparty. So I'm not going to expose myself by being collaborative until I know whether they're going to be. And we've observed this in some of our other experiments where people, particularly the more experienced negotiators, often seem to be those that were most cautious about moving to a collaborative approach.
Mm,
And a lot of this comes down to one of our favorite topics, of course, of how much have you really done effective planning to really understand the style that
mm,
you want to promote and how you're going to get there. And how
mm,
much have you really invested in understanding, finding out what you can about the counterparty to
mm.
either know their preferred style or to perhaps soften the brand a little bit so that you're coming to that negotiation with a degree of harmony?
Sure. Jim, last week we had David Tolan joining us, and we talked about redlining. But one of the things we also talked about, Jim, was that a lot of organizations actually don't have a clear strategy on how they want to negotiate. So negotiators just kind of tumble into the conference room and accidentally end up in a positional orientated negotiation or collaborative orientated negotiation. Even though if we look at the word cloud here, this is just, we just gathered all the words that was mainly used throughout the 38 episodes. And then we broke it down to the key ones that was used the most. And back to two questions, really, Jim. One is about the accidental, just tumbling into the conference room and accidentally end up in collaborative or positional negotiation. That's question one for you, why you think that happens. And question number two, if you look at these words here, Jim, is there any of these words that stand out for you? And could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Your first question, I think it happens to all of us, right? You know, in a perfect scenario, you're there from the start, you can set your strategy, you can go through everything, but a lot of times you kind of fly in to save the day, right? And by default, if you're just coming in mid pitch, mid proposal, mid deal cycle, it automatically becomes positional, because now the end game is, well, they have their terms. I haven't had time to develop trust with anybody. I'm just coming in because we have to sign a contract in the next 2 days before the quarter ends, things of that nature. So I think by default, unfortunately, it does become positional most of the time because of those reasons, right? In a perfect world, everybody thinks their clients are going to sign as is, or the client thinks the vendor is going to sign up to their terms, etc. But the reality is that doesn't happen, right? So a lot of times that happens. You know, words that signal importance or value. Actually, one thing that was on your previous slide I caught, and you know, maybe it should be here too in a way, it talked about end idea. It was down in the bottom left. And I saw that, and I think a lot of times we individuals who might be in a negotiation chair or coming in to help from a contract standpoint or risk standpoint sometimes forgets to get through the point and going back to, what is that end idea? What is that end result we're trying to get to, right? Is it a strategic partnership? Are we just trying to redline battle of the forms? Like, what are we really trying to get to? And I think, unfortunately, you have to pivot back to that a lot in order to be successful and kind of get back to trust, value, etc. You know, from there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Tim, is there any other words on the screen right now that stands out to you?
I mean, I think these are aspirational, and yet we do come back to the point that I think many of our programs reaffirm the point that, yes, this is what we aspire to, but it isn't actually what we organize for. That, you know, too often the wrong people, or rather the people who need to be involved are not fully involved. The timing of their involvement is not great. Very often, negotiation is already compromised by conversations that have taken place early in the process. I mean, the litany of observations continues, and sadly, at the moment, hasn't shown a great sign of improving. And of course, that is probably what the theme of the book should be, Keld, that, you know, we've got to stop just aspiring to good. We've actually got to think coherently. And Jim, we've been interviewing you recently as part of a group where we're looking at this whole question of negotiation resilience. And, you know, Keld, you and I have a lot of lovely conversation with each other where we enjoy, well, I particularly enjoy just sort of teasing you about stuff. And of course, one of those has been around this whole thing of a chief negotiation officer, which was one of the themes we explored. And, you know, while I, just to be controversial, said stupid idea, Keld, you know, of course, it isn't in principle a stupid idea at all. But what we're discovering as we talk to chief negotiation officers or you know, central teams is they're not really charged today with building capability across the organization. They tend to be a sort of troubleshooting team, a drop-in squad that can go to the difficult negotiations. It's not actually building organizational capability. And that is really what seems to be lacking. One of the conversations we had, people said, well, you know, you can't really do that because you take the spirit out of negotiation. You know, this is an art form, not a science. What did we discover on that front, do you think, as we had all these conversations?
Well, it's you know, it's a very interesting question, Tim, and something that us being in the world of negotiation are constantly debating is negotiation a science or an art? And I think my conclusion so far is both, really. If it was just an art, everybody would, or not everybody, but some people would be born into being a great negotiator. And that's not the case. Nobody's born to be a great negotiator. And if it was purely a science, everybody could study it and become good at it. And that's not the answer either. So let me throw it to you, Jim. how do you see it? I mean, you are a really qualified, great negotiator, and do you see negotiation being art or science or both?
Oh, I see it being both, without a doubt. I think back to Tim's point around, what works at companies and, having that a tax squad. I think by default, that's just what ends up happening, right? You just end up having this team of like a center of excellence, and most companies will have people fly in those most complex negotiations that are out there. But in practice, and I think, Tim, you made a good point there needs to be that overall strategy across the board, because the reality is your SWAT team can't touch every single deal that is out there, every single transaction, every single negotiation, nor should every single one qualify for one of your most senior people to fly into, right? So you need that overarching strategy, and I think many companies are trying to get there, right? What is that investment opportunity to make it happen? However, is the investment going out and training everybody on negotiations when they're not negotiating for another 2 years, their particular transaction? So it is a challenge, right? Of like trying to, create this philosophy of how to do it going forward.
Right. Anyway, just to move on, because we have a lot of ground to cover here today, we broke down the key messages from all the episodes. And for those joining us late, I can say we transcribed 38 episodes, 967 pages, and 300 and I think 70,000 words. And one of the key things that came out as a key lesson from all these episodes was negotiating blind is one of the biggest risks. And what we mean, Tim, by negotiating blind, if you remember that episode, and we actually repeated that topic several times, is that too many negotiators enters the room without a clear understanding of their own cost constraints or the real needs of the counterpart. And this blindness leads to lost value, wasted time, and missed opportunity. Tim, is that something in your history, your past, your experience, that you see that negotiators are not really well prepared? They don't know their own cost, they don't know their own value, and they show no interest in the counterparts.
Yeah, I mean, I think we still operate in a world where many people do tend to take the view that preparation isn't really that important. To the previous point, one of the things we drew out, because of course, coincidentally, Keld, we shared the point that we've also been looking at sort of a number of the episodes as part of the overall negotiation content that we're building into the AI tool at the moment. And one of the themes that we observed, if you like, that really does emerge from it is curiosity. Although the word maybe wasn't used directly with the same proportion of cases as value or trust, it was an underlying theme very often, of course, goes exactly to this point. If you've got curiosity, you want to know the information, you want to understand the other side.
Right.
I do just want to highlight the point. I think it is interesting, out of the words that were highlighted, that technology, artificial intelligence didn't really come up. But of course, that is going to be, and we've had some discussions on that, of course.
Yeah.
It is going to be such a game changer overall in the way that we can build that organizational capability and put training at people's fingertips, So as you say, Jim, maybe somebody who only does negotiation once every couple of years, and therefore you're quite right, formal training is not a great investment. But having that on-demand capability to go in, refresh yourself, have a virtual conversation with the counterparty using AI. We're going to see so many ways now that we can begin to really improve the standard of quality of the negotiator.
I think one of the key things here is the word preparation, as both of you mentioned. I was just sitting with a client last week, an energy company, and one of their head negotiators, you guys think I'm joking right now, but after the 2-day workshop, he came up to me and said, the amount of value we could generate if we just start preparing for at least 15 minutes before any negotiation, that would be amazing. So what he was basically saying is we don't prepare at all. And these guys are doing $1 million contracts day in and day out. And it's unfortunately it's not an unusual case, Jim, that people are just stepping into one negotiation after the other, and the time they allow themselves to prepare is the transportation time they have from their own office to the counterpart's office if it's a physical meeting. So hopefully the transportation time is pretty long. Otherwise, they have no time to prepare whatsoever. So this is kind of an unintelligent question for you, Jim. But why is it that we don't really appreciate the need and the importance of preparation?
I think it's a different philosophy in how you were brought up, right? I think typically you're kind of, feeling that pressure in a sales cycle where the deal's got to close. I got one issue, I have this issue, maybe I have 5 things to solve, and people are more focused on just getting to signatures. So because they're leading that sales cycle on it. But I think in those bigger ones, there has to be that top-down philosophy, and we believe in it, of having the prep and actually taking the time to understand and kick off with, not just your own internal customers and stakeholders, but externally as well, and actually sitting down to explain the process, walk through the contract. This is why we write things a certain way, because, primarily I might work in cloud. Cloud is very different than outsourcing, right? And how we do work and what type of terms are there. So the average person on the other side of the table needs to understand where those gaps are. So just having that prep from that side does it as well, and being able to handle it.
Sure. Tim, one of the words I mentioned already that kept reappearing throughout all the episodes, and back to what you said, we invite people typically we like, so we might get a kind of an unfair amount of people who think that trust is important. But trust reappeared constantly, and I think the conclusion that we could draw from the transcripts was that the most successful negotiations are built on mutual trust. When trust is present, information flows more freely, and parties are able to be more creative. So let's raise the topic once again, Tim, on trust. And I think everybody can agree trust is a good thing to have, and then we all walk away and thinking, yeah, we should definitely have trust. But trust is such a hurdle for everybody. So what's the shortcut, Tim? What's the advice that we can give based on all the experience on how to get better at the topic of trust?
Yeah, I mean, we've obviously got a lot of interesting factors in all of this as to how we build trust. And of course, part of it, Keld, is we know, recognizing that negotiation in many respects, and certainly the scene setting for negotiation, starts way before we get into that negotiation room or on screen talking to each other. We've already got perceptions, Jim, I'm sure, coming from Google, with the reputation the oil industry generally has of being non-negotiable, probably is immediately a scene setter, because you've got to disarm the counterparty, and well, unless you want to live up to the reputation, of course. But if you want to build an environment of trust, you've got a bit of a mountain to climb to say we are actually negotiable here. So I think a lot of that underlying self-reflection on what is it, how is it that I'm conceived before you get there, and what can I do to create an environment that causes people to trust me? Now, that also means you've got to be very thoughtful about your negotiation sequence and agenda. One of the big fears people have when they're in negotiation is of the need to make commitment. And if I make a commitment, am I going to get bitten? So, of course, we're very often in negotiation trying to contain and constrain our commitments. And that obviously isn't going to create an environment of great trust and confidence. So if we want to build the confidence in people that they are safe making commitment, we need to think about the mechanisms through which they will have that confidence. That's why, Kel, you and I talk a lot about governance and the standards of relational type contracts. Focus a bit more on how we're going to communicate with each other. What sort of data do we need to share with each other? Get to the stuff that is not actually contentious, that is about the framework for that more collaborative, trust-building environment, and then you're going to find the tough stuff of liabilities and indemnities and liquidated damages and intellectual property rights. It's going to flow much easier if you feel that, hey, this is somebody I can trust and work with.
Absolutely. We talked about it before, but in my doctorate, we studied trust in negotiation and found that it's actually not just a nice thing, it's a monetary value. We could actually capitalize it, Jim, with up to 34%. So what we concluded was that in negotiation with a high level of trust, the parties could capitalize up to 34% more value compared to negotiation with lower level of trust. Does that sound like a very laboratory theoretical number, Jim, or do you believe there's some truth in that trust will actually capitalize into true value in negotiations?
I would think yes. And, Tim brought up, a point around making additional commitments. Like if I have the trust up front with somebody and I get to an agreement that we can't make such and such commitment, right? For X, Y, and Z reason, they're trusting me that I'm explaining that I can't do a certain task because I may not have the people to do it, right? Or I may not actually need to because I'm not regulated the same way they are. And being able, so I see it already creating value because now I'm not exposing myself by creating operational processes that don't need to exist at all. I think a tip from my side to the community out there in terms of what works to kind of kick off that trust factor. We'll do our own kickoff after setting something. Do not redline this contract. Let's sit together. Let me walk you through where you're going to find certain terms in that contract that might be important to you, because a lot of times folks will look at something and it's the battle of forms. Hey, I don't see this clause. Let me put it in this contract, right? But if I can walk somebody through over a period of half hour what each area of my contract is, I can then point to, look, I know you're a bank. Here are where we agree that we are already covering all those regulations that are going to be important to you, et cetera, instead of just getting back into a bloody red line that, doesn't do anybody anything.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Tim, the world famous most negotiated terms from Will CC obviously took some space in some of the episodes as well. And one of the things that we have discussed, and right now I'm just going through some of the highlights, the highest ranking words and topics that were discussed, was expanding variables, expand value. So one of the conclusions throughout all these episodes was that typically negotiations are including too few variables. We are just negotiating the usual suspects and not really being creative and being curious, as we talked about already, and asking questions. So what we learned doing this research here, that negotiators who brainstorm and negotiate more variables, not just the typical 10 most negotiated terms, consistently create greater joint value. And the difference, as I said here, between 5 variables and 50 could be millions in real value. Tim, you've been doing this for 20 years plus, the most negotiated terms. And as we all laugh about, which is a little bit sad really, is that it doesn't really change a lot. And Tim, why is that we keep negotiating the same things that doesn't really create any progress? I think there's a quote once thing saying, real craziness is keep doing the same thing over and over and over and expecting a different outcome, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, we come back to the point that far too often the negotiation planning is such a fragmented activity. And I loved your comment about avoiding red lines, Jim. I think we had a very interesting conversation last week, as you say, Keld, about good ways to do it if you must. But it's one of those things we do by rote, by habit. And again, it's actually something that really has only emerged in relatively recent years. I mean, as you rightly point out, my career goes back far enough that I certainly can remember pre-redlining days, and in many cases pre-contract days. And of course, it's the introduction of the formal contract that has in many cases really disrupted and devalued the negotiation process, formulated it around templates and rules and procedures and compliance. Those weren't words that were used when I started negotiating. I didn't think about compliance. It was a question of can we do it or can't we do it? And if we can't do it, is there a happy medium that we can find and work together on? So I think there was just a very different spirit. And I think the rigidity of contracts has got a lot of the blame. We must blame for a lot of this. So what does that say to us? Well, our key messaging again that I think came out from quite a lot of the programs is around that creativity. It's around that openness, not trying to just go in to argue a point, but to appreciate the counterpart's point of view. And when I look at the variables, Keld, well, I must say I shudder a bit when I see on the slide 50 plus. That sounds like a lot of variables to me. But of course, over the course of an extended negotiation, it may well be that you do finish up with that number, but probably not a great idea to go in on day one and say, well, here's my pages of variables. What do you think of this? Um, but but introducing variables again implies that you have stepped back and understood the business goals, the interests, the strategies of the counterparty. Because introducing variables that have no relevance to what they're really interested in is inevitably, of course, just going to generate a pretty curious look and probably somebody thinking, what on earth is this person? So really establishing variables that you have good reason to believe will accord with counterparty interest, that's a massive positive. Again, as long as it's achievable from their point of view too, and compatible, I suppose, with their goals from the negotiation.
Sure. Now, actually, Tim, you were pointing out AI a bit earlier, and this is a wonderful opportunity to start embracing AI. Because the lack of creativity human beings sometimes represent is definitely fulfilled through AI. So why not, for instance, upload a contract, remove everything that is confidential, obviously, and then ask AI, please help me expand the number of variables we could negotiate. And, the outcome is just amazing. Tim, this is kind of a stupid question for you. Do you use AI in your negotiations at Google?
So do we have a standard way to do it? No. Are there those who are trying to get smart and use it as a job enhancer? Absolutely. I preach to my team, every week we're doing prompt exercises to learn and think about different creative ways of how to do it. For those who are at the table today, the next time somebody asks you to extend out their payment terms, I'd ask you to go put in if they are a public company, throw their 10Q or 10K into AI and ask it to see if there's anything that justifies the ask of extending out payment terms. And what you'll find is you'll get quotes back from a CFO that says, hey, I'm very liquid. I know I'm going to be able to pay all my bills. Look, that solves the argument right there. So it's there. It is such a helpful tool if you're using it correctly in it.
Absolutely. Tim, one thing you and I have discussed both online and offline is the lack of a mandate. I think we actually discussed it last time we were together in Edinburgh as well. And funny enough, one of the key items that came out of researching all this episode was actually the debate about the mandate, or rather the lack of. So preparation and mandate clarity are non-negotiable. And what I mean by that, we talked about preparation already, is that too many negotiators simply don't have the mandate. And throughout the episodes, this was picked up as well as being a key thing. So deal obviously collapse and drag out when mandate is unclear, when stakeholders are not aligned. And I remember one of the pieces of research, Tim, that we did where I forgot the number now, but there was a huge number of negotiators telling us that they didn't even feel it was a real negotiation, that the counterpart was just pretending to negotiate, perhaps because they didn't have the mandate. So the question here, Tim, is why do we see so many negotiators sitting negotiating for enormous amount of money and really don't have the mandate? Well, what's the problem?
Well, to a degree, I guess it comes back to trust. But in this particular instance, of course, it can often be internal trust. We put people forward with a limited mandate because we either don't really want to negotiate as a corporate or as an organization, or alternatively, um, we just don't invest in training the people in order. Um, Training is a tricky thing. We've talked in some of the sessions about the risks of training people how to negotiate, not what to negotiate. And we've
Right.
cited a few examples where uh, perhaps sales teams have tremendous negotiation skills from the point of view of body language and empathy, but actually have not been trained in the substance of what it is that is going to occur in the negotiation.
Mm.
Um, on the counter side, we've had others who have been trained very much in the what to negotiate, but not how. Um, and it's that holism that is often, I think, absent. Um, one of the, I had Adrian on our team who's really been looking at the ingestion of all this negotiation material. And I said to him, well, one of the things you've observed as you've listened to um, a whole range of these episodes. And he said, something that really came out to me from many of our experts is the extent to which good negotiation is a social activity. That, behavioral economics helps us think about negotiations as a blend of psychology and economics. And, you know, I'm not sure those non-negotiators see it that way. Uh, I think for those who report that they encounter non-negotiators, of course, again, an important point to reflect on there. Is this happening with high levels of frequency, or is it an occasional experience? And for
Mhm.
those where it's a high level of frequency, again, maybe it needs a moment of self-reflection. Am I doing something that's creating that environment? Um, and of course, a lot of what we're trying to train and give guidance on is helping people get around those types of barriers. Because if you've gone into a negotiation and the first time you realize is you're facing a non-negotiator, it comes back to the point you didn't do very good planning.
Mm. That's a very good point. Tim, how do you secure that you're negotiating with the right people, that they got the authority to sign the deal?
I think that important kickoff conversation up front is important, right? Let's be honest of what other stakeholders need to be involved. If anything, we're not needing 20 people to get on the phone right now on both sides, but let's be honest of each other's approval process behind the
Mm.
scenes, right? If we agree to something on the phone, I want to make sure we're not coming back to it again and just being upfront on it. And it happens, right? There's plenty of times you go through a whole transaction with somebody and then somebody's like, now I got to give it to legal for their thoughts. And it's like, whoa, 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 we just negotiated something for a couple of weeks now and we just agreed to terms. And now you're telling me it's all open again for discussion. So it's critical up front to kind of set that stage of who's really the end result and the end approver when it comes to it. And, unfortunately, you got to have that upfront conversation and not assume.
Right. That's a very good point. Tim, years ago, you and I had another discussion where you claimed that a lot of negotiations were virtual. And I said, no, Tim, that's not the case. Most important negotiation, people are taking the time to meet up face to face. And then we researched this and you were right. Very annoyingly, but it actually turned out that 70%, even more than that, was predominantly virtual negotiation, even in major contracts. So one of the things we could drag out of our 38 episode is that most virtual negotiation tend to be done by email, which is really scary. Even though the same negotiators admitting they're doing predominantly virtual negotiation actually admit that the best negotiation will actually happen when we meet face to face. So in our study and based on the episodes, Tim, we could see that email was number one, phone conversation, online conferences was number two, and video were number three, and then we had face to face. So you have the opportunity now, Tim, to tell me I told you so. But why is it? Is it just because of technology that the virtual negotiation keep climbing, or Is it because even though that we all agree that face-to-face meetings are better than virtual meetings, it's just a cost reduction approach from organization, or why is this happening, Tim?
Well, I think a lot of it at the beginning certainly was the cost reduction driver. Of course, when we first looked at this pre-COVID, we were shocked at how few people were in fact using video conferencing. Um, we knew that in some industries there was a reluctance that, was being resisted by the CIO, who was saying, no, no, it's not secure. And of course, suddenly it became entirely feasible once COVID hit and people had no choice. Suddenly we were able to use video conferencing. Um,
Mm,
so that, of course, then really exploded the proportion of its use in negotiation.
mm,
Um, it's still, it depends very much on the protocol. So, I mean, I guess the point here is that the sophistication of our planning, again, really needs to increase. All of these mediums have a role to play.
mm,
What we need to do is understand what role they play, and of course agree that with the counterparty. And then when we do that, we need to agree some codes of practice, what we equally expect of each other in terms of behaviors. Uh, we would generally have done that in a physical negotiation. You expect certain norms and standards of behavior, engagement, etc. Uh,
mm,
the problem with things like video is, well, some people turn their video on, some people don't turn it on. Talking to a blank screen in that sense, or a blackened screen with somebody's name on, just feel quite disrespectful and disengaged. Um, Obviously, the old conference call, you were always a bit suspicious. Was there anybody actually there? Uh, and so all of these mediums have got their pros and their cons. We need to make sure that we're using them to greatest effect. Um, the inclusivity that we can create, for example, by a virtual presence is
mm,
so much better. I think as long as you've got people with screen on, then of course the video conferencing is great because you
mm,
can build a sense of rapport, and research has shown that people do. We're all familiar now with talking to each other on the screens and observing those little facial expressions that actually give away some body language elements that many say, oh, if we're not in a room together, body language doesn't count. Well, that's not true. Tone of voice, even on a phone call, can give some stuff away. But
mm.
we do come back to that need for better planning and to a degree better education on how to use these different media effectively and what not to do.
Mm. Tim, how do you decide when to do something virtually and when you want to take the time and travel to see somebody in person?
Um, I mean, we we love Google Meet. I'll say that. But at the end of the day, when you decide, I mean, sometimes you just got to break bread with somebody. You just need that in-person sit down to shake hands. I think a majority of things can absolutely get solved over virtual meetings, 100%. But when you're at a standstill, your list is not getting shorter in terms of issues list. Those are the times when, yes, you have to get on a plane, go sit down together, and work collaboratively together in an uninterrupted environment. And sometimes that is the way to do this. And when you're sitting together, we can then establish those principles together. We can take our pauses, our breaks to go get whatever discussion on the side I need to have, and then get right back to the negotiation table. And when you're sitting in person, there's this sense of just the trust is now elevated even more because now we're together, right? We're working together. We're trying to solve a problem together. So I do believe a majority can get solved virtually. But there are those times where just, unfortunately, the only way to do it is to actually sit down, shake hands, and let's work together to get it and go out for a beer afterwards. And, If you need to get a beer beforehand and maybe everybody will negotiate better, great. But whatever the outcome is that you need to do is we make that distinguish based on a deal is not moving enough. However, that opportunity, that value, that partnership is so critical that's how we're going to get it done.
Right. Tim, not surprisingly, if we look at the recent years, the topic of AI have slowly been increasing during our episode. Not a big surprise. And I think one of the conclusions that we can drag out of all these hours and hours we've been talking negotiation is that AI is not surprisingly here to stay and is a crucial partner when we negotiate. I also think one of the conclusions we could drag out of our research was that people are a little bit concerned about the technology. They definitely see it as a partner, but people are concerned if obviously from their own point of view, are we going to be replaced? But I think one of the conclusions is that AI is a solid partner that can really improve and help us in negotiation. But one of the conclusions we could see was also that people are saying the human touch matters. So AI is important, but it's still important to have people involved in it. Now, when I was delivering a workshop on AI in negotiation at the recent World CC Summit in Edinburgh, I had, 100 plus people in the room. And I was asking them, Tim, how many of you have actually used AI in your negotiation? I don't know if my mic was not working or what, but I only counted 4 or 5 hands going out of probably 100 people. So we are talking about AI. We can all agree that AI is a really important, powerful tool. I'm a big fan myself. And yet so few organizations and people are using it properly and organized. And Tim, we've been warning them for years. Why are they not listening, or what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will have amazing impact, and this is both at an organizational and a personal level. But probably the personal level is somewhat dependent upon the organizational level getting sorted first. I mean, if you think about the power of AI and analytics, it can, for example, dramatically improve the quality of the input we give and the preparation for the negotiation. It's going to give us the ability to look at past experiences with that same customer or supplier. It's going to give us the ability to understand what their interests are, what precedents we've had in terms of what we've negotiated in the past. Where did we get to? Why didn't we get to a different position? What were the hard points? What were the easy points? We're going to get a whole lot more information at the hands of the negotiator, which is going to be invaluable in putting forward good propositions that are likely to succeed, and which, by the way, may reduce the need for quite a lot of negotiation, because, of course, if negotiation could have been avoided, what's the point of having it? We shouldn't be just glorifying negotiation for the sake of it. But we also then need to look across the portfolio of the relationships and contract types that we're dealing with. I think it's exciting at the bottom end of the scale. A lot of simpler transactions will move to becoming fully automated. But with the advent of AI, we're probably going to be able to introduce more in the way of optioneering and customization that enables people to essentially negotiate with the machine, because here's my set of options that are available. And of course, we will get machine to machine down at that bottom end. And really thinking through, as we've been trying to analyze, what is the depth of the relationship and the nature of the relationship and the importance of the relationship is going to determine, I think, the way that AI and analytics is used, whether it's as a support to the human at one end, or a replacement, or even creating new capability at the other end. And of course, a factor that we've talked about a little bit on one of the shows, but think the jury is still out, is the extent to which people are actually more ready to be open and transparent when they're talking to a machine than when they're talking to a human.
Right.
And we know from other research that one of the big barriers to good negotiated results is the hesitation both parties tend to have in revealing data, in being completely open and honest about what they're trying to achieve and what good looks like to them. Um, Yet they appear to be more ready to share that with the machine, enabling the machine potentially to really accelerate not just the negotiation, but the achievement of that missing 34% of value that you talked about.
No, absolutely. I know one of the takeaways from our study too was exactly as you point out that trust, honesty, and transparency went through the roof when both parties were embracing AI, which to me was a big surprise. But it actually makes sense back to what you just said. Um, Tim, talking AI in general, and I actually just want to connect it to another takeaway from our research here, is that everybody agreed of all our 50 plus guests that continuous learning and adaptation are essential, including AI. So I think one of the takeaways is that the best negotiators are those who reflect on their practice, learn from each negotiation, and adapt their approach based on data feedback and changing circumstances. And I guess AI, Jim, is a changing circumstance right now. And in my world, AI is not really a big scary thing. It's just another tool in the toolbox, like a calculator, or a spreadsheet, or a computer, or a Word, or what have you. Would you agree with that, Jim?
I think it has the potential to be
Mhm.
something else, right?
Mhm.
I think there are companies out there who might be using it as essentially negotiation agents that are,
Mhm.
trying to, battle the positions, etc. However, I am more on the philosophy of enhancer, and that is where for these complex negotiations you need to live and be. And it could never be replaced. A negotiator could never fully be replaced because otherwise, to Tim's point, what's the point of negotiating to begin with, or why are we even doing this? But at the end of the day, it is a job enhancer, and I see it more being that toolbox, but not just for the negotiation itself. It is speeding up deal cycles like no other if you use it right. What do I mean by that? It's speeding deal cycles in that I get a red line back from a client. It's all over the place. Hey, quickly take a look, and I need to summarize this for my leadership to understand what the main issues are, right?
Mm.
The amount of time it would normally take to kind of read through, explain rationale of like why they might be asking this or not asking this, saving some hours of time. It's saving hours of time to be able to then reflect, right? Show me all the different deviations from my standards, and is there a cost impact on those? And if I didn't do this, there could have been a better outcome from a
Mhm.
value standpoint, etc. So I think it's here to stay, but it's about you adapting and using it of how it could help your company the best.
Absolutely. Yeah, I very much agree. We don't have much time left, so I just basically want to wrap up with some conclusion from our research. And one of the things, Tim, that we found was the positive sentiments in negotiation coming from all our experts. And one of them was trust and relationship. So all our experts generally stress that the value of trust building is very important. We talked about that already. Most of them, and back to what you said originally, Tim, perhaps it's because of the crowd we invited, but most of them are embracing and focusing on collaboration. So the preference for win-win approaches over competition. And the other thing that I thought was interesting to pull out as well as a key item that was repeated over and over again was the emotional awareness. So acknowledgement of emotions and support for emotional intelligence in negotiation. Talking about AI, something that we know from studying AI can actually help us with, even people are saying that AI doesn't represent emotions, but it can actually do that. I had a discussion, Jim, with my wife the other day. The content is not really important because my wife wins most of the time, but I took a break, as you should, during that debate, and I went to ChatGPT and plugged in the dialogue and said, what should I do? And he actually came up with a perfect solution to how I should deal with that debate with my wife. So I went back in there and everything went really well. So I can recommend ChatGPT when you're in a heated debate with your spouse. It works really well. So that's an advice I can pass on. Anyway, we have some negative sentiments in negotiation as well. And there was a general, and this is interesting, Tim, a general frustration with traditional styles. So experts were criticizing old-fashioned combative approaches focused solely on winning. So back to what I said, we all want a collaborative, open, transparent environment. It becomes difficult in reality. And then back to the AI discussion here, Jim, and that is technology concerns. everybody agreed that it's useful. Technology may reduce human connection or create communication barriers. So that was some of the concern that was actually picked up during our sessions. Is that a valid concern, Jim, or is it just because we are scared of new technology?
I think it is a value concern because we all have our own style and technique, right? And you know, a lot of times as write-ups come, it could become a little bit too formal in some of these prompts answers that you get, and then you need to revise it. Then it sounds too playful, and then you're going back and forth on tone as it relates to that. And sometimes you as the person could have just wrote it and it's, you know, your outcome's a little bit better of how you're delivering. I think there is concern because then what happens when you get in those situations that it hasn't seen before, right? So you still need to learn, you still need to know and be able to determine, is the output actually accurate or not, right? There's still a lot of that too, to be able to actually, you know, diffuse any concerns of whether there is a misinformation coming out of the tools that people are using.
Right. The last thing I want to share with all you guys. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think important too to remember that very often our commitment is to people rather than organizations, and certainly one of the strengths of face-to-face people negotiating is the bond of commitment they form to each other, which is why, of course, very often complex deals can go awry if one of the key negotiators changes a company and disappears, for example, because there is that bond of trust and commitment, and you advocate for each other. I think very often in big negotiations, obviously, and we touched on this in some of the programs, the importance of feeling you've got that alter ego in the counterparty, somebody with the power and influence to watch your back, and that will live up to the promises that were made.
Sure, absolutely. I think the last conclusion I want to share with everybody based on the research of our 38 episodes is the complexity acknowledgement. So in general, all our experts, Tim, could agree that negotiations are recognized as complex and culturally diverse, requiring some flexibility. And I think we actually have several experts that independently of each other said, if you participated in one negotiation, you have participated in one negotiation. And I really love that quote because it's so true, isn't it? I mean, you can't really necessarily take everything out of one negotiation, put it into the next thing, and then magically it's just resolved. It's very independently. So anyway, I saw a lot of questions. Can we get a copy of the slides? Absolutely. I have more slides than what I shared with you right now. And Tim, we haven't even discussed about it, but I would love if we actually got together and created a research paper on this. We got all the data now, and I think there's a lot of very useful data then that people could really get some value out of. So if you have the time, let's sit down and do that. And Jim, if you want to be part of it, I would love to have you on board as well.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim.
Yes, I think absolutely that's right. We absolutely cannot let all of this wealth of experience and insight go to waste, and so trying to build this consolidated view is really helpful. And we must acknowledge, of course, all of those experts who have contributed to date, and we are not, of course, saying that this is the end. We will be finding more and more of them, because to the point you just made, this is complex, but also the point we said earlier, curiosity here is everything. So that readiness to learn, to draw from the experience of others is what has, I think, been so enriching for this series.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jim, for taking the time.
Great. Thank you for having me and appreciate it as always. And if any other questions, happy to chat afterwards.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.